Joining, just giving it a few more moments for everyone to log on, and then we'll get started. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Lane. I'm the Vice President of Programs for the Los Angeles Business Council. We're excited to have you all join us today to celebrate and discuss the LABC Institute's newest study on an agenda for equity-centered clean transportation, authored by our partners at the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. For those of you who don't know, the LABC Institute is the 501c3 research and educational arm of the Los Angeles Business Council. Since 2010, the Institute has partnered with leading academic institutions such as UCLA to develop research-driven policy solutions. It has produced over a dozen reports looking at issues of the solar market in Los Angeles, housing affordability, economic development, and now most recently, zero emission transportation. So how did this study come to fruition? Well, following the announcement of the governor's executive order that all new vehicle sales had to be zero emission vehicles by 2035, and that all new medium and heavy duty truck sales had to be ZEV by 2045, the LA Business Council Institute reached out to the governor's office of Business and Economic Development, GoBiz, who were tasked with leading the development of the ZEV market development strategy. And we offered our assistance in providing research that could help inform this strategy. During our conversations, it was clear that recommendations were needed on how to achieve equity in the rollout of this executive order and how to ensure the success of ZEV programs and policies in reaching priority communities. And JR and the UCLA team will get into what priority communities are in a bit. And that's when we reached out to our longtime partners at UCLA, led by JR DeShazo, who have produced several reports for the state already on clean transportation. To support this study, we put together an advisory group representing city and state government, major employers, environmental and environmental justice groups, and transportation companies. The group met several times during the development of the study to provide feedback on the direction and the recommendations. This was a crucial component of the process that was very important to us at the LABC because we wanted to make sure that a study on clean transportation equity was actually completed with a diverse group of stakeholders that represented companies, communities, and various levels of government that are involved in crafting solutions to address transportation emissions and air pollution. This research represents a new strategy to expand and identify how to measure household and community scale progress toward expanding equitable access to clean transportation, and it makes recommendations to develop a feasible agenda for near-term and long-term equity-centered policies. We're excited to share these findings with you all today, and as the governor has recently released his May budget revise, including billions of dollars for clean transportation, the conversation could not be more timely. We have an outstanding group joining us today. I'm going to go down the line and introduce them. We have JR DeShazo, director of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, the study author, and we thank James Del Filipino on his team as well. Tyson Eckerly, deputy director of Zero Emission Vehicle Market Development for the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. We have Patricia Monahan, commissioner for the California Energy Commission. Annalisa Bevan, assistant division chief for Sustainable Transportation and Communities Division at the California Air Resources Board, and Leslie Aguayo, program manager for transportation equity at the Green Lining Institute. We'll kick off the day with a presentation from JR, and then move to responses from our panelists, and then finish a conversation with some Q&A. Please feel free to ask any questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens. You can start putting in questions now until we begin the Q&A. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible within our time frame. And without further ado, I'd like to now invite UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation Director JR DeShazo to present an agenda for equity-centered clean transportation.
Adam, thanks so much for that kind introduction and for pulling together such an incredible panel. I feel honored to be among you and participate in this conversation. Let me start by motivating our report. I think many of us appreciate the impacts that our transportation system have had on our low-income communities. And one argument for centering equity is there are many disparate impacts borne by communities of color and low-income communities not only do they live near freeways and refineries and other transportation-related infrastructure, but they often have the least access to reliable transportation and clean vehicle options, and bear the health cost as a result of those factors. So there's a moral argument for centering equity as we look ahead and try and accomplish the governor's executive order. There's also a practical argument. There's no way that we can get to the 2035 and 2045 goals unless we bring those moderate and low-income households into the clean transportation future with us. And so there's an ethical and a practical argument for centering equity and making it as effective as it possibly can be. And I just want to start with that recognition. I'm going to share my screen now. Adam, thank you so much for recognizing my co-author, James DeFilippo. I want to highlight that these disparate impacts really ought to be tracked over time so that we know whether we're making progress or not. And I suggested, and the report discusses these to some extent, 3 groupings of performance metrics we might think about tracking over time to know whether we're making progress with our clean transportation policies. One is reducing the criteria and toxic air pollutant emissions within these communities. And there are different ways to both directly and indirectly track progress in that space. Second, we want to be minimizing the cost of travel for these households. We might want to make it cheaper for them to access the destinations, the workplaces, the grocery stores, the medical services, the educational opportunities that they all want to get to. And related to reducing the cost per VMT or passenger mile travel, we want to improve overall access, reducing travel time by frequently used modes and increasing the transportation modes that are available. So there are different ways we can measure improvements in our transportation system and how they impact the quality of life of these communities that we're focused on today. And I think it's important to keep these performance metrics front and center as we think about how we're going to develop an equity-centered clean transportation agenda. So I'm going to talk very briefly about this agenda, which focuses on 3 categories of strategies. And the first category is going to focus on privately owned new and used electric vehicles. And how do we transition moderate and low-income households more effectively into privately owned electric vehicles. The second category is going to focus on expanding place-based active transportation, e-transit, shared e-mobility programs. The goal here is to increase the access that households have to new modes of clean transportation. And then the third category is a category that we haven't talked a lot about, even at the policy level, which is how do we leverage the new zero emission fleet vehicles by thinking about, as that transition occurs, where are we choosing to deploy those vehicles? What places, what communities, what neighborhoods are we putting those vehicles in? What choices can be made unilaterally by local governments to accelerate the integration of and deployment of clean vehicles? What strategies require public-private partnerships with other transportation service providers? And I'll talk more about this sort of third bucket, but it really focuses on fleets and the fact that we are making choices already about where to put clean vehicles when they move into a fleet. We need to think more carefully about that. So my plan for the presentation then is to take each one of these strategies and show you the specific examples of what recommendations exist within each of these 3 categories. So that's where we're headed. And I'm really delighted to have have GoBiz, to have the Air Resources Board, and to have the Energy Commission with us, as well as the Greenlining Institute and Leslie. They have all played and will continue to play really essential roles in developing and shaping clean transportation policy, I think, as you'll see when we get to their presentation. So each of these three strategies draw on different participants that are on the panel already. I also want to just briefly acknowledge the fact that in developing this report, we really built on a lot of great work that's been done by other policy advocates, community-based organizations, other public agencies, and I want to call out Greenlining's Clean Mobility Playbook, which I hope Leslie will take some time to talk about later on, that they just released that. And so there's a lot of work that's integrated into this agenda already from other contributors that I want to recognize. I think so turning to the light-duty vehicle passenger policies, I think everyone is aware that our existing focus on the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program, which gives rebates to new car buyers when they purchase an electric vehicle, I think everyone knows that that program isn't delivering incentives to predominantly low-income areas. And this is, we first studied this in 2015 on behalf of the Air Resources Board. And so one of and there have been reasons, there are good reasons that we see the skewness that we see, but now as the secondary market is developing for electric vehicles and used electric vehicles are becoming available, we need to think about what are the other strategies. And so in this broad area of how do we encourage moderate and low income households to purchase and use EVs, one of the things that is really obvious is that we need to expand the Clean Cars for All program, both increase the budget, which the governor has just done, and expand the geography that has this program available to it, much greater than the three air quality management districts that currently provide it. We also think that we should be expanding vehicle financing pilots. There are 2 or 3 pilots within the state. Some of our analysis shows that even though financing has a modest effect on the propensity for most households to purchase EVs, it can be surprisingly cost effective as a public program. The third point on here is something that is talked about frequently: the need for charging opportunities within multifamily residences. Here in the city of Los Angeles, we actually have a surprisingly large number of chargers in MUDs. I think the state needs to focus more on evaluating programs that have been successful and maybe revisiting the IOU programs, which initially were motivated really with a focus on MUDs, but most of them have backed away from that now because they discovered it was more difficult than they thought. The Clean Vehicle Rebate Program continues to operate, and our recommendation, and we've made this recommendation for many years, is to continue to decrease the income cap so that program is available primarily to moderate and low income households. And then we have to think, the fifth point that I have here is we have to think about the cost of transportation fuel in the form of electricity and make sure that residential refueling for moderate and low income households is as cost effective as it can be. And what that means is making sure that our care and our fare programs, which provide essentially low income assistance, are widely participated in, and that we continue to protect those. We need solutions in the public sector side that allow those to happen because of some of the limitations on care programs for the MOUs. And then we need to ensure that low-income households are aware of all of these programs. There are, and the Air Resources Board may talk about this, there are now a stunning number of potential sources of rebates that are available when you purchase a new vehicle or a used vehicle, depending on where you live. We might want to streamline that, but we also need to make sure that households, when they're income eligible, have a very streamlined way to access multiple programs, right? And that's the goal of Access Clean California. So, this first bucket is kind of focusing on the first generation of electric vehicle adoption strategies, which centered on the private vehicles. And now we need to think about how do we reform these. I like to say, how do we engage in an equity retrofit fitting of these policies to really make sure that they're now reaching moderate and low-income households. So that's the first bucket. The second set of policies are newer in some respects, and these are active transportation investments in communities, investments in electric transit, shared e-mobility. And here the Air Resources Board has really started to scale some of these programs very recently. So the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project has a number of both implementation and planning grants. That's a great strategy. The Clean Mobility Voucher Program, similarly, trying to increase clean mobility options, modes in specific communities. And then within the CCI stands for the California Climate Investment Program. Now for, I think, going on 7 or 8 years, the Cap and Trade program has been funding low carbon transportation programs and the Transformative Climate Communities programs through the Strategic Growth Council more recently. And these are all programs that really make it easier for communities to have access to zero emission buses and other really innovative clean modes of transportation. I didn't go through the challenges of each of these, but for this program, the challenges are that many of these programs are place-based, so they're geographically limited in scope, and they affect a relatively few trips, but the households that do have access to them, those are sort of transformative investments. Apologies for my dog. So let me move on in the sake of time to the third bucket. Now this third area is a broad area where there's a lot to unpack here, and we don't have all the answers, but we want to really lift this area up because we think medium and heavy duty vehicles and fleets in general are where we can achieve the greatest improvements in air pollution reductions if we're deliberate. And so the first two recommendations here, I think, are the ones that we can act on right now because they just require city and county governments to take action. And the first is to recognize that already we're electrifying many fleets. And many of those fleets, like transit buses, school buses, waste recycling, sanitation trucks, street services, utility trucks, and then private delivery trucks that are sort of under contract, those are all fleets that are being electrified, and local and county governments get to decide where to deploy those fleets. Where to deploy those electric vehicles. And the argument here that we're highlighting is we ought to be committing right now to putting clean vehicles when they enter a fleet, deploying them and putting supportive infrastructure in the most polluted communities. So the argument here for this third bucket is really simple. When you have a fleet and you're electrifying that fleet, have a deployment plan that takes into account environmental justice concerns and tries to maximize the health improvements that are available. So the shared mobility programs, many of those programs, car share, micromobility, paratransit, van pools, if they're not publicly subsidized, they're publicly regulated. And so there's an opportunity, just as with this first category of mostly public fleets, there's an opportunity for the government to influence where these vehicles are deployed when they're integrated into their fleet. And then when we get to the fleets that are embodied in the third and fourth point on this slide, we're talking about fleets that focus on parcel delivery, so Amazon, FedEx, UPS, and others. We're focused on transportation network and courier companies, so these are privately directed fleets that deliver passengers, food, groceries. In these instances, we're going to need either state or local, either regulation or more likely public-private partnerships to make sure that as these fleets are electrified, again, they're putting these vehicles into those communities that are most polluted by transportation sources. And we already see pilots within the state of California and Los Angeles in particular that focus on zero emission delivery zones. And you'll hear more about that later on. The last fleet segment that is worth mentioning is the one that is sort of latest in its development, but that is the electric and hydrogen business-to-business vehicles. So these are your big box stores, the grocery stores, convenience stores. Again, these heavy-duty vehicles, class 7 and 8, typically are entering these communities to make deliveries and pickups. And we want to think about, as they electrify, again, where are they putting their vehicles? The challenge here is that every one of these fleets is going to require its own strategy and careful thought about how we accomplish this. But there's an opportunity here that we're missing in many cases, I feel like, and I want us to start to think about how do we prepare for that. And I want to point out that for fleets in the third and fourth category here, for parcel delivery and for transportation network and courier companies, there's likely to be a market service that allows you to pay a little extra and have green and clean delivery. And once that starts to happen, we may be entering a world where those households that are wealthier can command and demand clean delivery, while lower income communities may not have that opportunity or may not be able to pay for that. And so I think it's important, before that gets built in, for us to think about how to privilege those lower income communities and those most impacted communities, and pre-commit to have those companies make that sort of environmentally and socially conscious decision about vehicle deployment. All right, so I think I've talked far more than I should have. I thank you all for your time and your attention, and I look forward to my panelists' comments, critiques, and a lively discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, JR. And again, I want to just thank you and your team for all the hard work you always put into these reports. You go through such a thoughtful process to look at the issue and every related issue. I do appreciate that the report really breaks it down into buckets. So it helps provide kind of an easy pathway and roadmap to look at what is a pretty not digestible area right now for the general public. And this makes it a lot easier to understand where we can make some improvements. And I also think you should coin the term equity retrofit. I think that was great. We'll see that in some future reports. So I'd now like to welcome up the rest of the group joining us. As I mentioned, we have Tyson Eckerly, Commissioner Monahan, Annalisa Bevan, and Leslie Aguayo. So I want to start to get the group's thoughts on what we just heard. And Tyson, let me start with you. As Deputy Director of ZEV Vehicle and Market Development at GoBiz, how's the ZEV market development strategy addressing equity, and how can this study and others like it, like as the Greenlighting Institute has produced, how can these help the implementation of that ZEV market development strategy?
Yeah, no, thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And I think, as we think about, what we're trying to do with the zero emission vehicle market and the market development strategy, it's really trying to improve people's lives as much as possible, going forward. And so that when you first approached us, we knew we wanted to do equity. We knew we want to make big impact with priority communities. But really the question is how, and how do we go about doing it, right? And I think, how do we measure equity and priority communities and like the impacts in a way that, really measures kind of quality of life? Because that's really what we're trying to do, is improve people's life. We're trying to improve their access to mobility, their air quality, kind of what else can we be doing? And so this report, I think, is really helpful because it's almost just a menu, a laundry list of things that we can go down and check and, are we doing, are we not? And in fact, in the lead up to this, as it's looking at kind of giving ourselves a scorecard in a way. So I think, in the report, there were 28 actions, if I counted right. And I think we have a credible argument for that we're doing 12 of those, pretty aggressively. 4 we're kind of wading into. So, another 12 we really have to dive in. So I feel like that's a good starting spot. It's not like we're starting the game from zero, but it's so there's enough there to keep us encouraged to go ahead. We've started, but then there's a lot that we can work on and can do, and I think there'll be some good robust debates on kind of how to push that forward. And so just kind of a few things in terms of what we're doing to try to put this to work. And so the number one principle, the first principle in our ZEV market development strategy, is putting equity in every decision. And so if you marry these two things up, it's okay, well, how do we have this report, which has this great list of actions? Let's make sure that we're going through line by line and doing everything we can do to help implement that. But in terms of actually operationalizing, getting equity into every decision, so we've set clear objectives for each agency, working in partnership with these agencies. And each agency has put out an action plan, which is an annual action plan that goes through and says, okay, here's our core objectives. These are the things that we're trying to do this year to meet those core objectives. And with each of those things, we've asked the agencies to go back through, okay, is there anything else we can do to help increase access for priority communities? And if there is, we put it in there. And so those are all online. This community is really helpful. We want people to be looking at those plans, helping us identify more that we can be doing. And that's, part of the back and forth. We're also working on we're calling an equity engagement strategy, equity engagement implementation strategy, really just trying to get the basic lay of the land, because there's a lot of outreach we do as a state. I mean, the Energy Commission has great programs, PUC has great programs, CARB has great programs, at Strategic Growth Council. I mean, there's a ton of great work going on, just trying to make sure that we all understand where it is and what we're asking. And then, going forward, how can we make sure that we aren't asking twice, for one thing, and just kind of in pushing that forward. And so the other part I wanted to talk to, I think the most exciting thing right now is the May revision, which is a pretty windfall type of budget and big opportunity, and just there's a huge equity push built within that budget. And so we have, and Commissioner Monahan and Annalisa can talk about this too, but the big push on air quality, especially with the drayage trucks. We're to get about 1,150 drayage trucks, and they're supporting enabling infrastructure into the ground. And that's, really an air quality play. I think, it's in the report, we talk about trying to deploy these technologies in the communities that have been most impacted through time with, adversity with air quality. That's a big push there. It's 1,000 transit buses. It's 1,000 electric school buses. And especially with a focus on trying to get into those rural communities, with the littlest lungs. We also expanded we're going to expand the clean cars for all, we're proposing, the legislature has approved, proposing to expand the clean cars for all program statewide. So another 250 million into that, which is directly related to these recommendations. It's the CVRP, the Consumer Vehicle Rebate program. Is the putting low and moderate income. So there's 400 million added into the budget for that. These are all over the next 3 years. And so really, when we're thinking about the two things we really want to accomplish with the ZEV strategy with this budget is equity and scale. And I think those things really interrelate together. You can drive more equity by getting to more scale, creating more access, bringing these things down the cost curve. But as we're building that out, there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that the benefits are accrued to the communities that have been impacted the most, as soon as possible. So with that, I can hand it back, but I just want to thank you for taking this on. Thank you for making a very clear, concise list of things that we can go through and make sure that we're actively addressing, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Tyson. So Commissioner Monahan, let me go to you. The study talks about the need to expand incentive programs for ZEV infrastructure specifically, and to roll out newly electrified public fleets in low-income communities. The CEC has the California Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Project and the School Bus Replacement Program, which are good examples of that. Can you talk a little bit about those programs and what is what's in the works to improve and expand upon them, and then more broadly around the CEC's efforts to achieve ZEV infrastructure and vehicles in low-income communities?
Happy to be here. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, JR. And I'm glad I'm following Tyson, because I think he did a great job of laying out just sort of the broader plan by the state and the focus on equity. And I just want to start by saying, I think this is something that a lot of us feel very just committed to on a personal level and moral level. And I think, the the crisis that we're facing here as a state with what's happened with coronavirus and how that's really devastated communities and made it the gap between the have and the have-nots even bigger. So this is really about, what can we do as public servants with public dollars to create a more equitable society? And, it's hard. I want to acknowledge that from the front. And I think we're facing major inequities across our society. And as a lot of the, racial strife that we're facing as a country, bring some of that also to light around how this is about fairness on all sorts of levels. And so, what does it mean to create a more equitable society when it comes to electric vehicles and charging infrastructure? And it seems a little bit, sometimes you're like, oh, it's so abstract compared to a lot of the fights that we're facing today. But let me struggle with it. So as Tyson said, equity is really one of the cornerstone pillars of what we're trying to do through the ZEV market strategy. And at the Energy Commission, with the deployment of charging infrastructure and the deployment of hydrogen infrastructure and investments in the fuels ecosystem, we are really leaning in on trying to be more deliberate about what equity means. And historically, it has meant basically, well, is it in a disadvantaged low-income community? Check the box. And I'm like, well, no, that's not quite it. Is that a benefit? Is that directly benefiting communities? And Leslie and I have had numerous conversations. I'm looking forward to her thoughts on this. And, we've committed as an agency with our clean transportation program, which is about $100 million per year, needs to be reauthorized. So anybody can help with that. We would love that help. We've committed to we've set a goal of 50% of our investments benefiting disadvantaged and low-income communities. But now we got to figure out what that actually means. And we are working on that. And our goal is to be increasingly transparent about what that means so we can get feedback from the Clean Transportation Advisory Committee that Leslie sits on, the Disadvantaged Communities Advisory Group. We want this to be a public process that's vetted and open and transparent. We've done some analysis that gives us some food for thought. So we've been required by the legislature through legislation called SG 1000 to look at the equity implications of our charger infrastructure. And what we found is there are equity implications. I mean, basically the chargers are following where the EVs are. And as JR pointed out, EVs are going to wealthy people. So that means that we're not doing a good job in terms of dispersing. Well, I shouldn't say we're not doing a good job. That's too damning. But, we can do a better job in terms of creating equitable access. And this needs, of course, to be paired with equitable access to the vehicles themselves. And we've also, found that we need to do a better job across the state. So there's equity implications in terms of access with disadvantaged and low-income communities. There's also equity implications with rural versus urban communities. And, I'm particularly excited about the Ford F-150. I know that sounds a little funny, but I really am excited about it because it is, for the first time we have this vehicle that's like representative of kind of rural America. The best-selling car in America is going electric. And I don't know if you guys saw President Biden in the electric car, and he was like, "Woo, it's so fast." So, so the fact that electric cars are so fun to drive, I'm hoping that will also kind of get rural communities as excited as I am about electric transportation. But that's another factor in equity. It's like there's a geographic factor as well in access. As Tyson highlighted, the May revise that the governor has proposed really leans in on diesel pollution reduction, which was a finding that JR pointed out. A good share of the funding, I think it's of the infrastructure dollars. When I did the calculation, it was something like 63% of the money is going towards diesel. If you just look at the infrastructure and vehicles and separate out some of the planning and manufacturing grants, that a good share is going to diesel pollution reduction, which I think points to this commitment of let's make sure that as we make investments as a state, we're doing things to clean the air and support communities that are disproportionately impacted by air pollution. And, you know, so I'm excited about that. I think Tyson and I are spending, and others are spending a lot of time trying to highlight why this is important for public health and for equity. And so that to me is just, you know, demonstrative of the governor's commitment to zeroing out harmful pollution in the state. So on our programs, which was, I think, Adam's original request of me, we do have this program called the California Electric Vehicle Project, where we fund rebates for chargers. So this is for level 2 and for DC fast chargers. And if these chargers are located in a disadvantaged community, you get a higher rebate. So that's one of the ways we've been trying to incentivize the spread of the chargers, but we're also, and we can target our investments to specific communities as well. We are also doing solicitations like specific to multifamily dwellings. So we're going to be issuing that this year because we realize that this is a special challenge, and I could spend the entire time just talking about the special challenge in multi-unit dwellings, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to say that there are technological issues that we face. We are trying to wrestle with them, and we are trying to provide targeted funding just to address that specific challenge. On the school bus program, which is something, again, near and dear to my heart. Actually, when I was a researcher at the Union of Concerned Scientists, I published the school bus pollution report card 20 years ago. And California was ranked dead last because we had the oldest, dirtiest fleet in the country. And California spent a lot of time and energy fixing that problem, trying to fix that problem. The Air Resources Board has invested. So we invested in over 230 electric school buses that have the power to get energy back to the grid. So they're V2G buses. And that resilience aspect, again, is a huge opportunity, especially with vehicles like school buses that sit around often in the middle of the day and aren't used as much in the summer when we really need some extra juice into our grid. So we're looking at ways to capitalize on that V2G opportunity and give money back to cash-strapped school districts. So I do think, as Tyson highlighted a lot of the findings in the report, you know, we align very well with those. I think we are trying to, when I look at the list, I think, well, most of these we're doing, you know, we're giving out planning grants for both light and heavy duty. We've given out 34 planning grants on the light duty side. We're doing blueprints for medium and heavy duty infrastructure. We're going to give out 19 in that category as well. So we're really trying to make sure that we're doing this in a thoughtful way. I will say, on the vouchers, the idea that you had around vouchers, I was like, I like that, except you have to have the charger, you have to have the chargers or the hydrogen stations to be able to actually use those vouchers. So it's you still need the distribution of infrastructure to be equitable, and so that the need for charging infrastructure, I think, comes first before you layer on top programs like vouchers. So I think I'll stop because I feel like I've used more than my 7 minutes, and I want to turn it over to Annalisa Bevan, who is going to have a lot of great things to say on the vehicle side.
Thanks, Commissioner. That was great, and we're glad to have leaders like you up at the state fighting for us and fighting for communities. I will hop in a F-150 whenever it's out. I'm very excited about that. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it'll have mass market appeal. So it's good to see more and more options rolling out. So now let me turn to Annalisa Bevan. CARB, as we all know, operates many of the funding and infrastructure programs for zero emission vehicles. So, after managing light duty zero emission vehicle regulations and now transitioning to focus on zero emission infrastructure for all of CARB's ZEV programs, how are you prioritizing low-income communities that face the biggest impact from transportation emissions? And then if you wouldn't mind, Annalisa, just talking a little bit about all the medium and heavy duty work and regulations from fleets to advanced truck regulations you all are working on as well.
I'll try. Like you said, I've been a light duty vehicle expert for many years, and I'm just starting to get my feet into the medium and heavy duty space. In general, equity, this has been definitely an area of increasing focus for CARB in recent years and will continue to be growing emphasis as we develop, adopt, and implement our efforts to create a zero-emission, efficient, and equitable transportation system in California. CARB engages in several approaches to growing the ZEV market: regulation, funding, and complementary policies like infrastructure support, codes and standards, public awareness, and education, as well as analysis. Our funding programs have probably been the most visible and active in prioritizing equity. Two good examples of this are the Clean Mobility Options pilot program that provides funding for pilot innovative shared and on-demand clean transportation projects, and the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project, or STEP, that provides funding for community-based grants to assess transportation needs, build community support, and prepare for implementing clean transportation projects. The overarching purpose of the Clean Mobility Options and STEP shared mobility pilots, as well as Access Clean California, is to increase transportation equity in disadvantaged, low-income, and tribal communities throughout California. Both STEP and Clean Mobility Option aim to address community residents' transportation needs, increase residents' access to key destinations like schools, grocery stores, workplaces, daycare facilities, community centers, and medical facilities, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. STEP and Clean Mobility Options fund projects that are priorities for historically underserved and overburdened residents by requiring that projects center the knowledge and expertise of residents through all phases of project design, implementation, and evaluation. There's flexibility in both programs to fund many project types and to ensure the needs of each community within that community's context are met. Since fiscal year 2014-2015, CARB has allocated over $300 million to clean transportation equity projects to improve access to clean vehicle ownership and other clean mobility options in priority communities, including the Clean Cars for All program, financing assistance, Clean Mobility Options voucher pilot, Sustainable Transportation Equity pilot, Clean Mobility in Schools, Rural School Bus pilot, agricultural worker van pools, outreach, community transportation needs assessments, technical assistance, and Access Clean California. And then in 2021-2022, we're looking at adding workforce training and development. If I could comment on the report, it makes specific recommendations to several of CARB's equity projects, and we truly appreciate the focus of the report on how we can better center equity in our clean transportation programs, including specific recommendations to improve our vehicle ownership projects and clean mobility projects to better meet the needs of and provide just transition of clean vehicles to low-income individuals. We're currently in the midst of our annual funding plan process, where we engage with the public and communities to consider changes to our programs, so the timing of these recommendations is perfect. Over the summer, we'll be holding work group meetings to talk about changes to our programs, many of which the report recommends. And I invite those participating today to engage in our workshop process. I can put a link to our low carbon transportation investments program page in the chat. These funding programs really complement our regulatory activities. It's important for us to analyze the impact of transitioning specific transportation sectors to ZEVs for priority populations overburdened by unhealthy air quality. This, for example, is one factor in accelerating the goal of transitioning drayage trucks to ZEVs by 2035, 10 years earlier than other heavy-duty vehicle sectors. And for light-duty vehicles, passenger cars, and light trucks, as we develop our next generation of ZEV standards, we're thinking through what characteristics ZEVs need in order to be mature and match the expectations of car owners beyond the first owner. Things like easy access to battery state of health information, durability requirements for the energy storage system, meaning the battery or the fuel cell stack, and open access to repair information that make third-party repairs possible. In all of our regulatory development programs, we're increasing our engagement at the community level to take input, explore impacts, and learn from communities what should be included in our regulations to positively impact priority communities. And on the complementary policies side of things, CARB often isn't the lead agency, as we've been hearing about from CEC and GoBiz, but we're often the data agency and underlying production side driver with our regulations that help lead agencies understand how to prioritize their actions to support priority communities. So using reports like our state implementation plan, mobile source strategy and scoping plan, and community air protection program, we're documenting the public health need to transition to ZEVs and providing the roadmap for market growth for many different vehicle sectors. This in turn is used by CEC to forecast California's infrastructure needs, by Housing and Community Development and Building Standards Commission to develop building codes and support EV infrastructure, and by public-private partnerships like Veloz to build public awareness efforts. I've been working on ZEVs for over 20 years, and I can say unequivocally that CARB has fundamentally shifted from an approach of focusing on the new vehicle market and patiently waiting for clean vehicles to trickle down to the used car market and eventually benefit all communities, to instead actively working to change the pace and accelerate the benefits to priority communities through all of our actions. Thanks.
Thank you, Annalisa, and very glad to hear that. I feel, we did this report because there's no way we thought this executive order would be successful unless it was hitting every community across California. So, so far, just so encouraged by what everyone said. And let me move to Leslie last, but definitely not least. Leslie, the Green Lighting Institute was a crucial part of our working group that helped inform this study. You all have produced several reports already when it comes to zero emission vehicles and ensuring that the benefits are spread across California. Your most recent study was the Clean Mobility Playbook that JR alluded to earlier. Can you just tell us a little bit about the recommendations from that study and how they align with the agenda for an equity-centered clean transportation?
Yeah, sure. And thank you all for inviting me to speak on the panel. Nice to see some of you again. And Annalisa, nice to meet you. I'm surprised our paths haven't crossed sooner. I'm just going to go ahead and share a link to our report as well in the chat for folks to have. And as I was reviewing the LABC report and also our playbook, there are many similarities, and they were published 1 month apart. And so I'm really glad that there's a lot of focus on them. I'd like to start by maybe quoting actually something that I found really important from JR's LABC findings, which is the greatest challenge we now face in meeting our climate goals appears to be how to get clean vehicles into the hands of moderate and low income drivers, not early to market buyers. And I wanted to highlight that because I think oftentimes we tend to think about this transition to zero emission vehicles as, getting folks to buy into this technology to quickly transition from their gas vehicles to EVs. And I think two things are really crucial, right? Ultimately, if we're trying to reach our climate goals, it's not about the one-for-one replacement of EVs, but how do you make a holistic, sustainable, clean, and healthy transportation system for everyone? And that also includes public transit, active mobility, shared mobility, micro-mobility, and medium and heavy duty. And I wanted to highlight that quote because I think that in being able to shift that focus from early adopters to low income and moderate income folks, reform is really important. And I did see, speaking to Tyson's comments around the governor's budget, there is a lot of money that we did not expect to actually come out of the general fund this year, right? So $3.2 billion overall are going to go to clean transportation, and $400 million are going to CVRP. And so when we talk about reform, it's great that that money is going to these programs, but if those programs have not proven to successfully get to the hands of low and moderate income folks, then we really need to think about how to change these programs so that with this, new investment, we're not repeating the same mistakes. And income caps are a great way to do that. I think ultimately we really need to think about whether we just really need to ramp down CVRP, right? And if we are not going to, then we need to restrict it to the most in need. So that's the main thing I wanted to highlight that I think is really important from these two reports. I did want to dive a little bit deeper into our playbook. It is like 5 times as long as the LABC report, so not as condensed. But one thing that is really was really interesting to learn in this process was we did an equity analysis of about, I believe it was 12 or 15 equity pilot programs across the state of California. And so there's very specific recommendations and strategies around each one of those programs. And we did this by running a lens of each one of those programs through our equitable investment standards. And what we noticed is that the main thing we wanted to focus on is, these 6 standards, which I'm happy to share. One is emphasizing anti-racist solutions, prioritizing multi-sector approaches, delivering intentional benefits, as Patty mentioned, this direct versus indirect set of investment benefits, building community capacity, being driven by the community at every stage, and lastly, establishing paths towards wealth building. And so we looked at each one of these mobility pilots and asked ourselves, do these 6 criteria fall within the outcomes or out of the outcomes of these programs? And if not, how can we get them to be much more equitable? So then we were thinking about, this definition of equity and how different agencies and different folks have different forms of establishing equity. And ultimately we thought, maybe it's not one or the other, black or white. It's not a binary. Is it equitable or not equitable? But it's more of this scale. It's more of, a gradient of equity. And so we thought, okay, some of these programs are meeting this like baseline minimum requirements of equity. And some of these programs are actually really what we call transformational equity, which is changing the systems, pushing the status quo and the direction of the transportation systems that we really want to see for the future. And so that's highlighted throughout this report. And I think that I would, encourage folks to take a look at that as, how to push the bounds of making equity and transportation much more equitable. The last couple of things I did want to mention, because some folks on the call already highlighted this. Patty, we're with you. We are pushing for reauthorization. So we definitely need to make sure that the CEC is reauthorizing their AB8 funding, and in doing so, that equity is codified within that language, right? So definitely there to support, and if folks are interested in learning more about that, there's a Charge Ahead Coalition, which is supporting this campaign. And I wanted to note that, in this new governor's proposal, again, around what Tyson mentioned, it's really crucial to make sure that this money is actually going to be held accountable to equity standards. And again, I wanted to reemphasize, this reform of some of these programs, but also the funding that the governor proposed also went to utility debt. And that's really, really important, because there are billions of dollars of Californians that are currently affected by water and utility debt that would have completely change the trajectory of their financial stability. And if we're talking about electricity as a form of transportation fuel, those cannot be siloed. I'm sorry. So we really need to think about, what we're funding, thinking about where transportation is going, how suburban versus rural versus urban places are using transportation, how demographics are changing, right? We're thinking about the suburbanization of poverty, how land use is playing a role in this. And being really innovative. One of my favorite programs at the CEC is the School Bus Replacement Program. And I keep mentioning and highlighting that program because the VGI is amazing. I've spoken to some folks at CEC about how that program is really able to deliver benefits to low-income students during the pandemic. And so again, I just wanted to emphasize and highlight how, equity is a gradient, and being creative is really important in getting us to this new reality that we want to see for transportation. So happy to answer some questions in the Q&A, but I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Leslie. And again, appreciate your role on the working group. And you all have such a rich history working in this area. So we were just lucky enough to help build off of that. And it's nice to have a Northern California partner as we're here representing Los Angeles. So appreciate that again. So I want to move to some Q&A. I was going to ask a question about the governor's budget, but I think we've hit that. So I do actually just curious, JR, if you have any thoughts from what you heard from our group here in response to the study, that maybe we'll start with that.
Optimism. It sounds like we shockingly all agree that we need to continue to push forward. And I think we have to look at every single program and ask, is it really reaching the Californians who need it the most? How do we engage, in equity retrofits for existing programs, and how do we center the equity in new programs? So I'm really glad to be part of this conversation and look forward to the other questions.
Great. So I know Leslie mentioned VGI. We do have a question from the audience. So how do the panelists see VGI, so vehicle to grid technology, being incorporated to increase energy resilience in disadvantaged communities? I don't know if anyone particularly wants to take a shot at that.
Oh, I've got to start. That is the Energy Commission. So yeah, thank you for that question. Thank you for that softball for me. I mean, honestly, and this is an issue sort of broadly, is that if we, electric vehicles, when they're charged at the right time of the day, they're a grid asset. They put downward pressure on rates. But if they're charged at the wrong time of day, they could increase rates. And so this idea, which is really hard, it's hard to get your hands around that, because with gasoline, you go to the gas station, it's the same price all day long. You go to the hydrogen station, it's the same price all day long. You plug in your vehicle, it's a very different price depending on when you charge, how you charge. If it's a DC fast charging in the middle of the day, you're going to pay something very different, more like the price of gasoline. If you charge in at night and you have good EV rates, it's less than $1 per gallon equivalent for charging your vehicle. And so, just that simple, like, how do we set the right market signal so that the charging behaviors align with when it benefits the grid? It's its own special body of work, and it's really critical. I mean, that's what's justifying utilities investing in charging infrastructure, and that's where we could have a really great benefit to the state of California in rates, in reaching our climate goals, in having a 100% clean grid. So there is a really complicated aspect around BGI. But on the resilience side, which is also something I'm excited about, we do have this potential to have vehicles be a distributed energy resource and providing energy back to the grid at critical times and providing resilience for our communities. Some of one analyst, McKinsey, is finding, that half of our storage could come from, in 2030, just from old EV batteries. Those are things that we're testing out at the Energy Commission. Like, how do we use EV batteries as a second life to provide storage that's going to be, when we have times when the grid is down, we could access that storage. Or if we have wildfires and we're just trying to have a power safety shutoff, we could use that for resilience. So I think there's all sorts of opportunities. And again, the question is, how do you create the right market signals and the right policies to constrain it so that we are able to capitalize on that opportunity?
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. Annalisa, a question for you. Can you just give a quick explanation of the Clean Cars for All program, and are there plans to expand it beyond the current participating air quality management districts?
A great question, and something that I'm just getting my feet into with my new job change. So I'm probably not, I'm not ready to answer that yet. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
I can jump in too, Adam. Just
Okay.
well, in terms of the proposed May revision, the Clean Cars for All is intended to expand statewide, and so that's for that 250 million that has been added in 2022 through 2024. That's what that is intended for.
Thanks, Tyson.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. We do have a question about the convergence between electric vehicles, rideshare, and autonomous vehicles. So how do you see that convergence? Is there a future in which people don't own cars but use electric autonomous rideshare only? And this is kind of a leading question, but what are the advantages of that for disadvantaged communities or priority communities. I think, I don't know if Leslie, you want to take this one? I know you all did a report on this.
Yeah, I can take a stab at it. I wasn't one of the authors of the report, but I can share it in the chat. I believe I did put it in the Q&A as well. But I mean, I think ultimately this is definitely a reality that we need to be prepared for, is this future where autonomous vehicles will be on our streets. And the report I'm sharing is called Autonomous Vehicles, Heaven or Hell. And that's really, the title stems from this idea that autonomous vehicles can either create a transportation future where we're in a heaven, or a transportation future where we're in a hell. And if we don't take steps now to attempt to correct that path towards the heaven, we might end up with more inequities, right? And so some of the suggestions and specific policy recommendations that came out of this report are making sure that first and foremost, we don't incentivize single occupancy autonomous vehicles, but rather try to incentivize, again, active mobility, public transit. However, if we are going to have autonomous vehicles that they are, I just got a chat. Oh, sorry, not to me. That if we are going to have autonomous vehicles, that they are fleets of AVs, that they're electric, and that they're shared, right? That would be the most equitable solution rather than having private ownership. I think additionally, if we are going to move in this direction, we have to think about the workforce development component and the contract labor agreements that are coming out of it, rather than falling down this, TNC labor contract worker rabbit hole that we've seen Uber and Lyft, and, kind of have exploitative labor standards. If that's going to be the case with AVs, we really have to make sure we mitigate that, and that ultimately we don't use AVs as another way to increase VMT, right? Like, we should be focusing on pedestrians over vehicles. And if we are going to have vehicles, how do we make them the most equitable solution for everyone?
Could I,
Go ahead, Jared.
Adam, could I just build off of what Leslie just suggested? I mean, anything that we can do to decrease the cost of transportation options is going to be good for low-income communities, except when there's significant externalities. And as Leslie pointed out, the VMT impacts, what does that mean in practice? It means congestion. It means, and there's a congestion tax that low-income households pay that is so much higher than what moderate and upper income households have to pay. And it's hidden. I think we, as a society, we don't realize how much we tax low-income households with the cost of congestion, lost travel time, and additional vehicle expenses. And so I think for both TNC, so Uber and Lyft, they have tremendous impacts on congestion and VMT. And autonomous vehicles will increase that even further because they'll reduce the cost of travel. So we need to think about, as we move into those two technologies, what the implicit cost in terms of the congestion impacts will be for low-income households. And I think that's a point that gets overlooked far too frequently.
Thanks, J.R. Commissioner Monahan, a question for you. So in addition to all the vehicle to grid work you're doing, the CEC also oversees our building energy efficiency standards. So how is the ZEV infrastructure being considered in those building standards updates? And is there an effort, we discussed multifamily buildings being one of the barriers. Is there an effort specifically to try and get more infrastructure into multifamily buildings?
Well, our building, this is a question actually, I've asked our building standards folks too, because I keep saying, well, I mean, electric vehicles are more efficient. Why can't this be an efficiency standard? But we have very specific definition of what building efficiency is, and it's the building itself. And anytime we pass a standard, we have to demonstrate that there is a savings from the standard that we pass, and it has to be in the building footprint. So we're limited just by the law. It's the legal law, not the law of science, because science would say this would be improving efficiency. But that's another story. We are looking at the load management standards that would give some benefit for electric vehicles. So we are trying to use the authority that we have to advance through load management standards, electrification of the transportation sector. But I mean, this is what we're falling into are these, we as policymakers and legislators, put things into boxes. So we have like the building box and the transportation box and the electricity grid box. And all of a sudden what we're saying is, oh, no, 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 we need to get rid of those. We need to think of it as a system and figure out what are the system-wide approaches. So this is where the system-wide approach conflicts with what is in the letter of the law.
Thank you. Just actually a follow-up for you from your previous comments. There's a question, did Commissioner Monahan mention the idea of using old batteries for storage? Is that already being studied, and is that something the audience can learn more about?
It is being studied. We're giving out grants in this very space to study the use of old vehicle batteries for storage.
Great.
Is
that something
I mean, I
can look up on the website?
Yes. In fact, well, I'll ask my team if we could send some links. I don't have them. Leslie's so good. She's like the master of just sending, then the link here and the link there. I don't have that. But I'll chat with my team and see if we can get that.
And then Annalisa, I just want to pass to you for your thoughts on multifamily dwelling building standards and in EV charging infrastructure.
Sure. CARB's been the subject matter expert for the Housing and Community Development Commission and Building Standards Commission on development of building standards for both MUDs and for commercial non-residential properties. And we've really had a principle in mind of trying to maximize access to charging at MUDs, especially in new construction, but also trying to figure out how to crack the retrofit situation. And the standards which are in consideration right now that are, sorry for the distraction there, that are being proposed are really taking a massive step in requiring that actual EVSE be installed in multi-unit dwellings. And that opens up the door for requiring EVSE readiness and EVSE when an MUD is being retrofitted for something like solar panel canopies over the parking lot and things like that. So we're taking a massive step, and with a combination of EV capable, which is raceway and panel capacity, EV ready, which is actual receptacles for chargers, and actual chargers. Those three things together, we're taking a massive first step into making sure that new construction especially, but then retrofitted as well, are starting to see MUDs served with EV charging.
Great. Thank you.
And Adam,
oh, go ahead, Leslie.
Sorry, I just wanted to add a little bit to that, to the conversation around the intersection of building electrification and transportation. I think that, when we think about making this transition and we run it through an equity lens, it's really difficult to consider affordable housing into the mix and affordable housing finance. It can be really dicey and political, but I don't think it's impossible to do. This is also just another quick little plug, but we're working, my next assignment is to figure out how to do that research and to do, an equity intersection of building and transportation decarbonization. When talking to some affordable housing developers, oftentimes we will have to weigh the costs of number of units versus parking spots or the transformers themselves that carry that electricity. And so if the priority is housing folks, then transportation electrification doesn't win that argument. But I think that there is a future where we can start to make that a reality. Thinking about car share programs that have been pretty successful. Transform, which is a transportation organization in the Bay Area, has received CARB funding to do electric car sharing at a mobile affordable housing site in Oakland. And also, when thinking about using car share and using private vehicles at affordable housing, another argument I often hear is, well, aren't we trying to get folks to use public transportation? So why would we incentivize the use of single vehicle occupancy or single occupancy vehicles? And I hear that. And also, if you take a look at our transportation system, even those folks that are at affordable housing sites that are low income still do not have access to public transportation. And one example that comes to mind are the folks that live in the Bayview residence in San Francisco, right? They are highly isolated, surrounded by freeways, have to walk miles to the closest BART station. And so again, these are some of the things I think we should really consider when looking at the intersection of building and transportation.
Well, and let's see, one thing you didn't mention, which I don't know if anybody has yet, is for people who do need to drive, that battery electric vehicles can save $1,000 to $2,000 per year on reduced fuel and maintenance costs. So this idea of like, how do we make sure that lower income families who need to drive have that opportunity to save money is a really important one. And I feel like we don't do enough to highlight just the potential economic savings from battery electric vehicles.
That's a great point. Thank you, Commissioner. And Leslie, that was a great point about public transportation. You know, we've been working for well over a decade now on the intersection between affordable housing, our transportation infrastructure, and access to jobs. So the interconnection there is not missed upon us, and that's a great point. Tyson, a question for you. Beyond your ZEV market development role, you know, GoBiz is an economic development arm of the state. So as it relates to ZEV vehicles and manufacturing, what are we doing to draw in more manufacturing here in California?
Yeah, that's great. So there's a lot of opportunities. So I think, we're a natural hub already. I think, Commissioner Monahan says a lot, that California has become the new Michigan when it comes to zero emission vehicles. We have like 34 manufacturers here. It was our number one export in 2020 was zero emission vehicles. And that's largely thanks to Tesla in the Fremont facility. It's, delivered quite a few. But I think looking forward, looking at the governor's budget, there's a proposal for $250 million for grant funding that the Energy Commission would implement for ZEV and ZEV related manufacturing. And where it gets interesting, right, is, as we come in from the economic development perspective, GoBiz works with a lot of companies, and these companies are comparing states, and they're looking at supply chains, they're looking at workforce talent, but then they're also looking at, the total incentive package, right? And so a lot of times supply chain, workforce, talent, all that stuff, we have the upper hand a lot of times in California. So they want to be here, and the engineers are here, their headquarters are here, so they want the manufacturing to be here. But what tips the scales often is a free check, the money that, like other governors can write and say, we don't have that same capability here at the state. So like oftentimes our tax incentive programs can be matched by other states, and then they throw on some grant funding, and then you see stuff go out of state. So what we're trying to do is get ahead of that and capitalize on these big investments, like that 1,000 or 3,000 heavy duty trucks, essentially buses and trucks. Those are big orders, something that we can capitalize on and save a lot on shipping costs, even, for the markets. So I think it's a big opportunity through this governor's budget. And then of course there's bringing it back to equity, it's that workforce component, right? And so there's a big package for labor and workforce development that is also included in the governor's budget, like the high road jobs and high road job training, and making sure we wrap that around. So probably a longer answer than you anticipated, but there's a lot of excitement around it.
No, that's great. JR.
I wanted to just, if you permit me, to come back to the MUDs, and I wanted to focus on the need that we have as a state, as a nation, as an international community to increase the rate of charging and charging infrastructure to speed that up. And when we think about MUDs and we think about solutions, having quicker charging than we currently do is the greatest bottleneck that I see in electric vehicle adoption, and it would also have a huge equity spillover into MUDs. And of course, for those that are neck deep in this, it's not just having the charger be quicker, but it's also having the utility have the capacity to deliver that power, and within the vehicle has to be able to receive that power more quickly. And so there's something in here for everyone. I think ARB's incentives needs to privilege vehicles that can receive that charge more quickly, The CEC, which has its intellectual brand is new technology, I think needs to really help the state move, like we had with the Sunshot initiative, which brought the cost of solar from $4 down to 50 cents, a watt. We need something like that for charging infrastructure. So I just want to highlight that there's some technological coordination across state agencies that could really help us speed up and privilege faster charging that I think would have big equity impacts as well.
I wonder if I could say a word about in response to that. It's interesting that as we've been working through these MUD building codes, we've been arguing with advocates about the speed of charging at MUDs. The opening request of driver advocates was to install level 1 charging at every parking space in apartment complexes. And we argued back that that wasn't equitable, that we would be hamstringing MUD residents by giving them slower service. And so we've been countering with a minimum power requirement for all of the chargers and all of the readiness and all of the capable spots. We compromised at 3.3, but it's hard for me to even be comfortable with that when we talk with car makers who are increasingly talking about longer range vehicles with larger battery packs that will take longer to charge, and their minimum definition of level 2 charging is 6.6 kilowatts. So I think we have a starting point here, but I want to make sure that we're not only providing access to charging, but we're providing equitable access, that MUD residents have the same choice at how fast they charge as single family residents.
And JR, I got to respond, because I mean, this is a complicated question. And I think that fast charging, I mean, I love it, but you pay for it. You pay a lot for it. And so you're going to do that. You're going to have to get vouchers, because it's going to cost more than gasoline potentially to charge your vehicle. And, and level 1s are cheap. You could spread those out everywhere. So I just think there are different solutions out there. We shouldn't be always leaning towards the most expensive, fastest, but also towards what's going to be good for the grid, what's going to be fair, how are we going to get people access. Sometimes level 1 is fine. You're charging overnight, it's fine. Let's not constrain ourselves. I also think batteries are rapidly changing. Battery swapping is real. We have hydrogen options out there. What we're trying to do is have a multiple of different solutions and not be too wedded to any one.
Yes. So let me just say I agree with everything that's just been said, and I should have been clear in my advocacy, because I think where you have long dwell times, the slower the charging and the smarter the charging, the better for everyone. It's cheaper, it's better for the grid, and the longer the vehicle range, typically, for the more insurance you have, right, in terms of range anxiety. So I'm talking about, I foresee a future when, 65 to 70% of MUD residents cannot effectively charge at home. And they need a gas station type model for refueling. Now, maybe they won't need that, but I think that we're going to discover many of the housing stock that we have as a constraint is a huge constraint right now, and we don't have a solution. We just for much of the MUD space, when we think about where we need to be in just a mere 15 years, we don't. So I'm trying to think about Commissioner, I completely agree that the fast charging right now is immensely more expensive than the other options. But we do need to keep our eye on the MUD space. And I don't think we have the technological solutions for that. And it's going to be the poorest and the individuals in the lowest quality housing, and in the parts of the grid, the distribution network that have received the least investments, right? That historically, right? Because there's these structural inequalities manifest in our grid as well. And so, I agree with everything that's been said.
Can I say one thing too, Adam? Sorry, this is a fun. I agree also with everything, but I also want to talk real quick just on the hydrogen piece. So there's an announcement that came out this week that was really exciting in the LA. It's got the High Deal LA project, and what they're targeting on the industrial scale. So hydrogen kind of across, green hydrogen across multiple sectors, but including transportation. They're targeting $1.50 per kilogram delivered in the Los Angeles region by 2028, which for the
and Tyson, say what that is in dollars per gallon.
exactly. So, yeah, so 75 cents a gallon essentially would be, and 2028. That is an ambitious target. You know, there's some debate on what the timelines we can make, but I think the people behind it, you know, I believe in it. And so yeah, there's some real opportunity there as well. And so I think, you know, layering all these different solutions on, you know, the long dwell time, the fast charging, the getting as much multifamily, the hydrogen stations. So yeah, it's a big problem to solve. But anyhow, that was kind of exciting push with it. LADWP is a big push on that part of it.
Great. Leslie, any thoughts you want to add to this? And I think we'll close up after you.
No pressure. Well, I feel like we dove into the building conversation, but if I could just go back a little bit further forward to the question that you posed to Tyson around economic development. I think that there are a lot of really important and crucial bills that are going to be proposed this legislative session around workforce development standards. One in particular that comes to mind is from Maria Elena Durazo's office. I can put that in the chat also. And this one would be specifically targeting transportation-related manufacturing and workforce development standards. So folks would have to, if they are going to be applying for a bid or an RFQ or RFP related to transportation, charging infrastructure or related manufacturing, contractors would have to report out the number of jobs, the quality of jobs, the wages they're going to be giving folks, and then also how those jobs would potentially assist displaced workers from both this transition to the different kinds of fuels, so electrification, but also displacement from COVID. And I think bills like this, I just want to make sure that, you know, are highlighted, because if we're talking again about equity, yes, it's access, it's benefits, but it's also how we can use the transition to a green economy to be a just transition and a workforce development transition for folks, so that we have pipelines for, you know, formerly incarcerated folks, for folks that are coming out of community colleges, for folks that are, you know, really looking forward to getting out of this terrible recession that's been, you know, COVID induced. And I think this is one of the ways that we can do it. So just wanted to plug that.
Thank you, Leslie. And thank you, everyone. Tyson, JR, again, as our author, Annalisa, Commissioner Monahan. This was a great group and a robust conversation. There's a lot of passion and a lot of excitement, I feel like, about where we're headed. Still hurdles that we need to address. And hopefully this report can help us create a roadmap of where we're going next. Exciting news about the governor's budget. I think we're all hoping that it flows through successfully through the legislature. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. And thank you to our audience members who attended today. Just a reminder, if you want to read the full study, you can check it out on our website at www.labusinesscouncil.org. Please join us on June 11th for the Sustainability Summit, where we'll be talking more about these issues as a whole host of other clean energy and climate change policy as well. So thank you all and have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.